Greetings. Hey, thanks for joining us here on another episode of the Business of Agriculture podcast, where we are both audio and video. Reminder that if you listen to this at iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast, you can also go on YouTube to the Damian Mason channel. Just go to YouTube, type in Damian Mason channel, and please subscribe while you're there. You'll see some really good stuff that I put out about the business of agriculture as a podcast, but also as commentary and some other fun stuff. My guest today is Rob West. He is the founder and analyst at Thunder Said Energy, and we're going to sort of take what I did a few weeks ago with my interview with Kelly Garrett, the Iowa farmer who's getting paid to sequester carbon, and we're going to expand on that discussion and talk about carbon industry, carbon emissions, the environmental policies that's coming down the road, and how it will impact all of you in the business of agriculture. That's what we're talking about today with my new friend and guest, Rob West, with Thunder Said Energy. Rob, thanks for being on the business of agriculture.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So here's the deal. I so much want to get into the second round of this topic, and there's so many different directions to take it. But yeah, to refresh you, Rob, and I told you this before we started recording, I had an Iowa farmer on a couple of episodes ago, and there's only 2 farmers in the whole country that, by my research, that are being paid to do this carbon thing. So we in agriculture have been hearing all this ballyhoo about carbon sequestration, environmental policy. We can profit from it. We can integrate these into our practices. And frankly, I, along with a lot of my ag people, are like, great, show me the money. So that's what we're going to get into. And I want to hear so much from you. But before I do that, I want to remind our listeners and our viewers that the Business of Agriculture podcast is brought to you by my good friends at Harvest Profit. Harvest Profit is a software solution for your agricultural enterprise that works just as hard for your ag enterprise as you work for your ag enterprise. It's a business. That's why we have the Business of Agriculture. You should run it like a business. You need software that's modern, up to date, and will help you be profitable. Check out harvestprofit.com. All right, Rob West, I gave you the whole lowdown what we're going to do. Now let's talk about you. You're not from Iowa based on your accent. So give me your background and then what you do and who your clients are.
Okay, well, let's see. I've been a research analyst my whole career. I guess most recently I was running one of the top-ranked energy teams in the city of London and on Wall Street, and covering the usual suspects like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, Total, and I was going around meeting investors, talking to them about this thing called energy transition. And it just became clear this was going to be one of the biggest themes in the whole world for the next number of decades. But like most puzzlingly, you would talk to investors about this and they would say, yeah, so the way we're going to do this is we're going to, disinvest from conventional fossil fuel companies and then outbid one another on shares of Tesla. And, it strikes me that that might not be the whole picture of how we do this important task for the world. And if you really want to help people, maybe we need to find more opportunities. And so this led down the rabbit hole of creating a research firm focused on what are the best opportunities to actually get the world to this net zero goal. They've got to do 3 things. They've got to be economical. They've got to make you money. You can't invest in something that sinks you financially. They've got to be real. If you had a dime for every time somebody tweets that they've created a cold fusion reactor in their basement, you could have a good pile of nickels. Assume nobody has created a cold fusion reactor in their basement. And the third thing is these things have to take CO2 out of the mix. And one of the things, and this is kind of where I guess we pick up our conversation, is I thought starting this firm I was going to spend my time looking at wind and solar and electric vehicles. But you know what? Actually, the real interesting opportunities are in these hidden opportunities, the ones that have fallen through the cracks, that aren't covered by anybody or aggressively lobbied for, but actually can do an enormous amount of CO2 abatement at a very, very low cost in a way that restores nature. And so this has led us to do over 100 different research notes into 100 different topics, all backed up with data and models. And I got to tell you, you're talking to the guy who thinks that the lowest cost route to net zero CO2 in the world, actually, more than anything else, it involves farming carbon. It involves reforesting about 3 billion acres of the world at a price between something like $3 and $50 a ton of carbon. It involves restoring, carbon in soils. We've gone from 4% carbon in our soils in the United States to 1 to 2% because of the practicalities of mechanized agriculture. And I think there could be a 20 billion ton per year sink for nature-based solutions at the very, very, very bottom of this cost curve.
Hey, wait a minute. Okay, now here's the deal. I'm going to let you go for one more minute because you're giving us the whole thing, and I've got about a million questions about everything you just outlined there. So go ahead. So you're giving us basically the synopsis. You're basically saying, here's what I think. So go ahead, and then I want to go back.
Well, I warned you, Damian. I can bore for Britain on this stuff, and I promise you, I'm going to bore you for the remainder of the half hour. But look, I think we don't need to go through every single bar of the 100 bars on the cost curve of how we decarbonize the world. But what you need to know and what your listeners need to know is there are technologies out there to decarbonize the world twice over. Mm-hmm. So how do we choose between them? And my kind of view is, and this is a view, is we should choose the lowest cost technologies. On my roadmap, it would cost an average of $40 a ton to decarbonize the world. That's going to take about 3% of the average income of the average person, which is a hell of an enormous ask. There is no need to make this more complicated and more expensive by willfully selecting technologies that cost $300 to $1,000 a ton and take up, way more of people's income. And so, let's do a low cost transition, and let's do it in a way that restores nature, because that's part of the goal. And I think that's why we're having this conversation.
All right. So I love it. And so going to the beginning. So yeah, there you were sitting around as an energy analyst, mostly for investors. Obviously, investments say, okay, we have our analyst on this. So a lot of people would say energy analyst, meaning like you're analyzing how to, put more power into the grid. No. You were the analyst specializing in the energy sector for folks that want to put millions and billions of dollars into something, and you're saying, here's the deal. And then from there, you spur into this whole thing that, as you said, big money says, we can't invest in BP. We can't invest in Exxon. Those companies are evil. They get protesters. They're polluting the earth. And so this became a big thing here, Rob, 5, 10, 15 years ago, social investing. I don't want to have my...
Let me give you another ideology, and I think this is really important. I think the science of climate change is pretty clear, that the world's warmed by about 1 degree since pre-industrial times. It's warming by 0.03 degrees every year. And we've got pretty robust data from 30,000 weather stations showing this warming pattern over the last 40, 50 years. And it's most likely linked to rising atmospheric levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases like methane and NOxes. And so we've got to get the world's energy system to net zero. And the evil, you mentioned an evil, if there is an evil, I think it's the wanton destruction of our planet going unchecked, and the continued emission of unmitigated CO2. I don't think there's anything evil about meeting the energy needs of the world. I don't think there's anything evil about providing people with light or heat or mobility, or this is the week. This week we're recording this is record low temperatures in parts of the United States. I don't think it's evil to provide people with heat for their homes. Right. And so I think what would be really helpful would be to detach this discussion from a kind of demonization of certain companies that some people might have ideological problems with a kind of gulf of humanity, which is, let's avoid wrecking the planet and let's try and get the CO2 emissions in the world to zero. It might be that the lowest cost way to do that involves restoring nature and pulling a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere to buy a budget for people to continue using, conventional energy sources in a responsible and efficient way. And that's my model, and how, we can take a planet that's soon going to be 10 billion people and provide, life-changing modern energy to, people who are going to want it.
So what I like here is, and I told you when we started recording, my gripes with the whole climate, if it was global warming, became climate change, became climate crisis, the politicization of this is such that it turns off a lot of people. And then it becomes a political thing, like, well, you're a conservative, so that means you don't believe. And I'm like, no. I don't believe in the politicization of it. And a lot of people are that way. It's been forced down their throats. Your thing is...
Well, Damian, I got to tell you, I'm worse than a conservative. I'm an economist, and I don't have ideologies. Right. If a flying spaghetti monster was the lowest cost way to get the world to net zero, then I would want to use flying spaghetti monsters to get the world to net zero. Whatever the numbers say, whatever the data says, that's what ends up being, favored in my kind of economic roadmap towards net zero.
Now, you and I both know, because I'm not an economist, but I am an agricultural economist per my training, and I can tell you that what the problem with economics is a supply and demand, is a real world, is about human decision making, and politics sometimes seeks to subvert that or change that. Minimum wage laws, or shall we say rent ceilings, obviously are all really counter to what economics would tell you. But frankly, so are some of the things that we deal with in agriculture. Subsidies.
Yeah, I'm not that kind of economist. I mean, the type of economist that I am is somebody saying, okay, so you're telling me that you're going to produce green hydrogen from renewable electricity, and that I'm going to be able to go and fill my car up with green hydrogen. I'm the kind of economist who says, okay, so why is that going to cost what it's going to cost? And I will build very detailed models of the cost of these different technologies. And I'll give you the punchline. If the average person in America bought all of their energy at $15 a kilogram green hydrogen, it would absorb 100% of their annual income for the average person in America, which to me makes me think green hydrogen at $15 a kilogram is not a particularly viable solution to, get people other than the very, very, very wealthy towards decarbonization.
Yeah, so I like the fact that we bring the economics to it. You thought we were disagreeing, but we're not. So we're in agreement on that the economics thing sometimes goes against the actual politics thing, because the economics say this, and the politicians know that they have their agenda to push, or they want to appeal to a certain cause group that is their base, support, whatever. So about what you're saying here is that you look at the saying, all right, we want to get rid of the carbon. You said you called it decarbonizing the earth. And you said that there's a certain amount of tons of carbon that are out there. And the most effective way to do it is just through land use and land practices, because all these other things are politically pushed agendas. And you say the reality is you still want those poor people in Texas to be able to have electricity. Shit, they'd like to have electricity right now themselves. They're out of electricity. You're saying we want you to have electricity, but let's also address the carbon. And the way to do that is through land use, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, here are some numbers, because as we've just covered, that's the best currency in which to deal in this debate. The average acre of land can absorb about 5 tons of CO2 per acre per year through planting new forests, seeding new forests as those forests grow. You can probably get up to 8 to 9 tons of CO2 per acre per year by choosing the tree type. There are some slow-growing trees like oak. There are some faster-growing trees like poplar. There are some claims of a miracle tree that could grow, in the tens of tons of CO2 per acre per year. There's also crops which absorb carbon at a rate of 20 to 30 tons of CO2 per acre per year. The challenge there is that it's not woody biomass. So if you just kind of left it, it would decompose very quickly, and that CO2 would go back into the atmosphere. But there are models, of this stuff where you could grow fast-growing crops and bury it in the ground, and you actually take out 8 times more CO2 by burying your corn crop than turning it into ethanol, or similar for sugarcane in Brazil. You could bury that biomass and take the CO2 out of circulation that way. And the numbers are kind of fascinating, because with a $35 per ton CO2 price, that means a corn farmer in the Midwest make more money farming carbon than farming corn. But as you say, these are currently early stage ideas. The entire kind of nature-based carbon credit market is about 100 million tons a year. You will have seen in the news recently, Shell announced plans to be doing 120 million tons of nature-based carbon offsets by 2030. So that is one company coming forwards and saying, single-handedly, they're going to double the size of the nature-based offset market to offset that. And the reason this is happening, and I see this with more and more of my clients, is they look at going to run their steel plant or their data center powered by green hydrogen or 100% renewables and batteries, or any of these other fancy technologies that we've done work on. And they say, I can't do that. It's too expensive. It's going to make me uncompetitive. But there's a real desire to restore nature, take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we can do this for somewhere between $3 and $30 per ton in the best of these projects. I mean, I personally offset my CO2 emissions 10 times over last year. Cost me an average of $5 a ton. That's even with some conservative accounting. And I like thinking about that because there are all these people who say you should go and buy a ground source heat pump. It'll cost you $35,000 and it will take out 4% of your CO2. And I think, why would I spend $35,000 to take out 4% of my CO2 when I could spend $1,000 and take out 1,000% of my annual CO2? And so those numbers are just completely, as we say in England, chalk and cheese. And I think that's why the interest is growing in this area.
I love it. And my head spinning. I got a page of notes already. But before I ask you my next question, Rob, I want to remind our listeners that this episode of the Business of Agriculture podcast is brought to you by Harvest Profit. My buddy up there, Nick Horb, he started this company because he looked around and said, agricultural enterprises don't have a software solution that actually understands their business. And so that's what he created. And he's got customers now in 26 states and like 4 Canadian provinces. Canada, you need to step it up a little bit, all right? But anyway, you can check out Harvest Profit by going to harvestprofit.com, and you can use their software free as a trial for 14 days. And I really recommend you check it out because Nick's a good dude and he set up a company that will help you. So harvestprofit.com.
Okay. Well, I'm going to interrupt you there. And the reason I'm going to interrupt you is because this actually becomes really, really important in our decarbonization models. So we're going to continue the thread there. I mean, one of the biggest pushbacks I often get on the work we do is there enough land for this reforestation that you talk about? And so our model, I think there's 3 billion acres that can be reforested globally. But the biggest competing land use is agriculture, and there's about 2 billion acres of 2 billion hectares of degraded lands, degraded agricultural lands that could be kind of fit for reforestation. But then you also get into this fascinating debate about, if we need to free up land for reforestation, what are the ways to do that in the agricultural sector? And we've looked at all sorts of companies in this space, from seed companies that make the seeds more efficient by about 1% every year, through to exactly like you were just talking about, digital solutions that can enhance land productivity by somewhere between 7 and 15% on the studies that I've looked at. And if you think about the billion or so acres of farmland in the United States, and you think about freeing up 7% of that, then that's a lot of reforestation potential. And so weirdly, I talk to a lot of investors and they think the only way to invest in energy transition is we've got to buy stocks in solar energy, wind energy, electric vehicles. And I always think one of the interesting kind of non-obvious opportunities is ag tech, because the more land you can free up, the more reforestation can be done. So yes, I think that's fascinating space.
So you and I certainly in agreement. By the way, you used the word a hectare, and for those that are listening to this driving, down the road, and they're ag people and are like, "Damn it, I hear that term when we talk about international stuff, but I'm an acres guy." And hectare is 2.2, 2.25.
That's right, 2.2, yeah.
2.2. So 2.2 acres equals a hectare. So what you're saying is something that I actually have been telling my ag clients for about a year or so, that we're going to see marginal land, meaning marginal farmland, the stuff that's hilly, curvy, highly erodible, requires a tremendous amount of irrigation, just isn't that productive for whatever problems, is going to revert, because the reality is our good farmland can produce more per acre each year, and it has since the beginning of agriculture. We've gotten better with technology to do that. So Rob, you and I are certainly in agreement that those marginal acres will revert. And so you've got something in western Kansas that only gets 8 inches of rain. Why are they pumping out the Ogallala Aquifer to put water on those acres to grow corn that we really don't necessarily need, because we can grow that corn in Illinois, where the deep prairie soils and the moisture works? So some of these places become reverted. Now, some of them will be forest, but also some of them might be prairie grasses. Your chart here talks about carbon sequestration by crop, everything from poplar trees to oak trees. Then you also talk about bamboo and elephant grass. Um, the reversion to nature. The thing is, if I own those acres and I'm making money off of me farming it, and now you're talking about reverting, why would I be economically incentivized to do that? Is that where carbon comes in?
Well, this is where there
Because
comes a balance.
right now, if I have some crappy ground, but I can make a little bit of money farming it, and then the USDA gives me a little subsidy, and there's some other things that go along with this. I get some crop insurance, so even if it fails because of a bad year, my crop insurance is half paid for by the government. I'm not being mean; I'm being straight here. At least from an economic standpoint, since you're an economics guy, I'm going to keep farming that crappy ground, even though it might not be needed and it would be better off to go into carbon. Where does how do I get
Yeah, I
incentivized?
mean the challenge is that the ground that is crappy for farming tends to be crappy for carbon sequestration as well. Unfortunately, maybe less so, but I've certainly seen studies on the survival rate of newly planted trees, and the very dry to the very rocky to the very hilly. You tend to get planted survival rates in the 50s and 60s%. And the best land, you should be getting survival rates in the 90s%. And when I talk about those percentages, I mean the percentage of newly planted saplings that survive over 3 years. And by that point, we've pretty much got a viable tree, and we're going to be growing and taking that carbon up. So I think a realignment of policy and subsidies could really help. I think one of the biggest question marks is, people talk about putting carbon prices on industry in the United States. They start saying, if you have a petrochemical facility or a steel facility or a factory, we're going to come and we're going to charge you $50 a ton for every ton of carbon you put into the atmosphere. And I understand that that's a very good way to incentivize efficiency gains and heat recapture and digitization across these industries, and I'm very in favor of this. But it shouldn't be all take. There should be some give. And if you have a technology that can come and can grow 50 tons of you can grow a ton of carbon on your land, you should also be able to get that $50. If a ton of carbon is worth $50, then it should be a fully transparent thing. And the atmosphere doesn't care where the CO2 comes from. The atmosphere doesn't know whether a ton of carbon has come from a factory's flue stack or has come from failing to reforest an acre of land. It's fungible. And so if you believe the climate science and you want to incentivize a lot of decarbonization, really an economy-wide carbon tax where farmers could benefit, would be a really, really smart way of addressing that. What I think is really strange, I'm just going to make one more point, is there are policymakers out there who will take particular technologies and say, I love this technology, I'm going to put in place, and this exists right now, a $300 per ton credit for carbon sequestration via this technology. We really want this technology to work, so let's give $300 a ton to these guys because they can take these tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. Why are we willing to give these guys $300 a ton, but we're not willing to give a farmer $300 a ton to grow carbon and take it out of the atmosphere that way? Like I said, the atmosphere doesn't care, and surely a fair policy seeks to make a level playing field where everybody can benefit.
Okay, so when you talk about, since obviously we got ag people here, and they're saying, all right, great, I'd love to make money on this. First off, what do I need to do? What's required of me? I know we talk about different farming practices, et cetera. And then you've pointed out that the different amounts of, if we say, all right, a ton of carbon, as you said, is worth X. Now, right now, nobody's paying us for that. At least no farmers, hardly any ag people are getting that. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to yank out that carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's good for everybody. Okay. How do so there's going to be different from geography. Somebody in Texas is going to be doing a different crop. They're growing cotton, whereas somebody up in Illinois is corn, whatever. Tell me what you envision happening at the ag level to get paid. What are they doing? What do they need to do? Plant trees, that's one thing, but what about the actual cropping system that they use to grow our food?
Well, that's where agricultural productivity is important, because you need to free up the land um, to grow the forest, and that's going to take it out of production for food crops.
Okay, so
So
you think that the main thing for an actual producer to get paid is removal of some of the land and reforestation. What about actual cropping systems? Because we still
well,
do.
I think that's harder, right? And the reason it's harder is because um, I mean, you know the old cobra trap, right? Um, I think that, I mean, it may be an apocryphal story. The story is that, you know, the times when the British controlled India, they would pay people to come and bring in cobras because it's a dangerous snake, and you pay people to you know, round up the cobras, and then you can clean up the streets and make it safe for everybody. And you find that instead of, you know, the number of cobras in the population going down, it skyrocketed because people started breeding cobras in order to, you know, go and hand in the cobra and collect a reward. And I think a lot of people feel that way about, you know, if we have an industry that's there and it exists anyway, and suddenly you start incentivizing carbon prices for crops, you have to really know that it's incremental and it's not going to be gamed, you know, in order to make that policy fair and sensible. So I think the way I've seen it done for the crop industry is through soil carbon. So this is this area where, you know, and these numbers are fascinating. You can argue that something like 120 billion tons of carbon, which is, you know, something like 25% of all the carbon released by mankind, has actually come from soil degradation rather than from the combustion of fossil fuels. In fact, the crossover point where fossil fuel carbon, you know, surpassed soil carbon emissions was somewhere in the 1960s, so not that long ago. And you know, this is this history where every year you come and you plow up the soil, and it releases the carbon in the soil back to the surface so that it can decompose and go back into the atmosphere. And how, you know, through mechanized agriculture, we've gone from 4% carbon in our soils to 1 to 2%. And, you know, you'll know enormous amounts about this topic, but this growing practice of conservation agriculture that involves a mixture of, you know, no-till farming. It involves a mix of cover cropping. It involves a mix of crop rotations. There are studies that show that, you know, over a period of 30, 40 years, you can get that soil carbon back to this miraculous 7 or 8%. And the numbers are really variable. I think the academic literature is quite contrastive here, but the numbers range between 1 ton and 5 tons of carbon uptake per year just in the soils. And if you can lock that in the soils, and so that would be the area where, for the kind of crop production industry, there's a real opportunity to farm carbon that we've written about. And again, about $35 per ton carbon price, you know, conservation agriculture could allow a farmer to make more money farming the carbon than farming the crops.
Yeah, so that's okay, and I want to give a couple of those numbers because I love your numbers just to make sure that we're not overwhelming our listener. Um, the agriculture, as you pointed out, when we till, and I'm a conservation guy, so I'm way with you. I think I said in my book, by the way, dear listener, if you haven't, in Food Fear, I point out that we are going to look back at all of the tillage that we have done and the way that now we look back at using leeches for medical care. We're going to look back and say, why the hell were we out there beating up our tillage? Destroys soil structure. Tillage creates erosion. Tillage creates compaction. And tillage, as you point out now, is also guilty of carbon release. So we're going to do less tillage, and we should. By doing less tillage, then we are sequestering more carbon. We can get compensated for that. But you talked about putting more carbon into there. You know, we've historically been 4%, and now, because of practices and various other things, we're at 1%. What's the maximum we can get to in the soil percentage of carbon?
Well, I've seen numbers definitively showing 8% over 40-year studies. I think it's out of the University of Ohio that those studies have been done. You probably know guys like Ratan Lal and you know, the work being done there. But I think nobody really knows is the answer, is how
Okay.
much carbon you can lock in there, because soil just keeps accumulating.
So we can put more in there, and we do it through not tilling. We do it through establishing deep amounts of roots. And we can still do this within our cropping system. But as you said, the main thing is just getting out of the tillage. The crops we still got to have the crops because we have to eat. So we've got to do harvest. We can't, as you said, you could do a thing where you just grow corn and then never harvest it and never turn it into ethanol. And that's a net positive for carbon sequestration. But then we don't have the corn and we don't have the ethanol. We don't have the food. We don't have the gas.
Yeah. Are you familiar with TRLs? Is this something that ever comes up on your list? I know a lot of people hate acronyms, but a TRL is a technology readiness level. It's like a nine-point scale. 0 is a glimmer in the eye of a scientist, something that doesn't exist yet. 9 is something fully technically ready to go. And generally, when I talk to people, we only talk about stuff that's at TRL 6 or 7 or above. So it means we've got a demonstration plant, the technology definitively works, somebody's actually done it in the field. So we've talked a bit about that. You would put no-till agriculture towards the top of that list. I mean, it's ready. There's nothing stopping people from going out and doing this right now. If you go a little bit earlier into the kind of technology readiness rankings, I mean, you get some weird and wonderful stuff in here. I mean, there are groups of teams like at the Salk Institute who are trying to breed crops that would be genetically programmed to secrete lots of carbon into the soil. Like one example is crops that would secrete suberin through their roots. That's the material used in cork, or that's in avocado peels. And you could in principle have crops that just pull the CO2 out of the air, funnel it to their roots, and just decide, boom, I'm going to put a lot of carbon into the soil in a really stable way. And so, your answer of what's the limit, it could actually be, very, very high.
Well, what you've also just pointed out, though, is that this is really remarkable, because now, again, what can we do with the ag sector? Well, the reality is maybe this crop, which might be genetically engineered, which will cause another whole bunch of people to lose their minds, where we can plant a certain type of seed that is more about it grabs more atmospheric carbon and puts it in the soil. So that's one really important thing. Back to the other part of this about being incentivized. Who incentivized? I mean, in the ideal world, we know there's I think the gripe is always in the politicization. Do the companies volunteer, or does it become a government mandated exchange? So then Damian Mason's acres in Indiana say, we are yanking this much atmospheric carbon out through our practices, and there's maybe an audit or some sort of verification, and then I get paid. How do you envision it, Rob? How do you envision it working?
Well, I think it's going to end up being a voluntary market. And I think because it's a voluntary market, monitoring and compliance are going to end up being, the real challenge. Let me tell you what I mean by that, and then I'll tell you why I think that. The issue we have right now is I think there's a disconnect in policy where policymakers seem to want to give really high subsidies to incentivize these technologies over here, and basically not enough attention to low-cost solutions like these agricultural solutions that could do a lot of decarbonization over here. And I guess I got to be a realist. As much as I'd love to see that change for the good of decarbonizing the world, I'm not sure it is going to change. And some of the indicators that the incoming administration seems to be more on the side of preferring very direct subsidies for friend technologies over here rather than a kind of level playing field.
Define what you just mean, because we are going to be here for the next 4 years at least, and my people want to know. You just said the current administration prefers friend technologies. You're talking about throw money at solar,
wind, solar, hydrogen, batteries. I mean, there are some things that are just really in vogue, really in favor, and there's this kind of perception we've got to take these technologies and we've got to make them work at whatever cost. And I guess
as opposed to, you think a more pragmatic approach is, rather than throwing gazillions of dollars at a bunch of crap that may or may not work, what if we just let fossil fuels still exist, but then make it so that we change some farming practices?
Well, here's the way I think about it is, I don't know if you've ever been to an ethane cracker or been to an oil refinery, but you go to these things and they are complicated beasts.
Yeah.
And I think if you have a economy-wide CO2 price, and everybody who emits carbon pays that economy-wide CO2 price, then as the policymaker, I don't have to understand how the heat tubes work in the ethane cracker, okay? Because there's now an incentive for whoever runs that ethane cracker to make those heat tubes more efficient and take out that carbon to the extent that they can. And so you could do a lot of decarbonization at a very, very granular industrial level with that CO2 price that you could really never figure out and do with policy, because it's just too granular. And I think that's what, you know, where I'm coming from with this view. And if you have that level playing field and you were to include agricultural solutions that sequester carbon, you know, as part of that level playing field, then you would need to have a government program of how you certify that carbon is real. I've been through some of these carbon certification processes, and they're kind of clunky and kind of bureaucratic. I don't know if many of your listeners are, you know, familiar with you know, getting certified for things through and the way that affects you. But you know, I've been through some of the standards on this, and let me put the numbers in perspective for you. I think if I had about 50 acres that I tried to reforest, I think I could reforest that for about $5 a ton. I then think to get certified that my forest is real and has, you know, has satisfied the regulators on carbon sequestration would cost me another $5 a ton. So I have a choice. I could either take out 2 times as much carbon at $5 a ton, or 1 times as much carbon at certified carbon, you know, at $10 a ton. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, if certification is that expensive relative to the cost of the carbon sequestration, you know, wouldn't it be more logical to just do a lot more carbon sequestration and then have the buyer just verify it within a streamlined process that is going to bypass this very clunky certification that exists today? So how could you do that? Well, when it comes to soil carbon, there are, you know, fascinating things being patented, being commercialized, like coulters that you trail through the soil, and they take a reading based on, say, moisture content or other very rapidly detectable variables to estimate soil carbon in a very good, reliable way. Where instead of it costing you $5 a ton to certify the carbon in your soil, you know, it would cost you $0.50 a ton. Likewise, if I'm planting trees, instead of having somebody come around with a tape measure and literally hug every tree and measure its circumference and sort of draw a picture and try and estimate, you know, what if you had a series of drone and satellite technologies where, again, you could, you know, you wouldn't get the answer to 99.9% certainty. Mm-hmm. But it's nature. You don't need it to 99.9% certainty. That's a false level of certainty. Right. I want to know when I'm buying these credits for myself in a voluntary market, are they real? Is somebody doing a fraud? Is somebody claiming they've, you know, reforested an area that's a car park? And, you know, I feel like a well-designed carbon market that has a minimum imagery verified to come from the place that it comes from, drone footage, good algorithms to estimate the biomass in the trees. You could get 90% of the way there for, you know, less than $1 a ton of verification cost. And that would create this kind of virtual marketplace where people could go and they could say, look, I run a company, I want to make my company carbon neutral. I want to make sure that my carbon is written off against the carbon grown by, you know, Damian Mason at this plot, at this specific acre, Illinois, right here. I can put a picture of it on my wall in my business and tell all my customers. And that is going to be 100 times cheaper than converting my shop to, you know, burn hydrogen in its boiler or what, you know, whatever it is.
So that's kind of what's happening right now, you know, based on the guy that I had on my podcast a couple of weeks ago. It's Rob, is that a private company said, I want to be able to tell my customers that we are offsetting our carbon. So here's some money to this guy. And it went through an auditing process and was verified. And they're putting 1.15 tons of carbon in per acre. So here's some money. And it didn't seem like it was nearly what you're talking about. I think it was $15 a ton, but the marketplace is still not, there's not a real market. It's not like if I want to sell a bushel of corn, I know exactly what I can get for it today at delivery. Whereas this is kind of still out there. Is it going to develop?
Well, you've hit it on exactly the right point, which is one, the regulation is too clunky, and so people are bypassing that regulation and going onto a voluntary market, and then the voluntary market has to reassure its buyers that the credits are real. And we've talked about the ways they're doing that. There is no price yet. I mean, I've got a data file, of 30 companies I looked at that offer carbon offsets. You can go and you can buy them today, and the prices range from $3 a ton to $30 a ton. Because people are just selling. It's a voluntary market. They're selling whatever they want, whatever they can. I think, as we've also touched upon, there could be a much higher price if an economy-wide CO2 price came into force at $50 a ton, and farmers could sell their credits against that. So there really is no indication of what the price is going to be. But let me put it in perspective that I hope is interesting and helpful. If you have a $10 per ton CO2 price, and you wanted to, take a gallon of gasoline that you buy, and you wanted to offset it at that $10 per ton CO2 price, that would be like 10 cents a gallon. In other words, with the price fluctuation we've seen over the past few years, if you could offset that carbon at $10 a ton, it would be a rounding error. You wouldn't even notice the difference, compared to the sort of movements we've had in fuel prices recently. If I was going to do it $50 a ton, it would be like 50 cents a gallon. And again, I'm from Europe. What we pay per gallon in Europe is like $7 a gallon, because we put all these big taxes in there. And I think as a human being, it's somewhat disappointing to me that, when I pay $4 a gallon in taxes, nowhere has the government been able to say, we could take 10 to 50 cents of that and give it to somebody to like grow some forest to offset that CO2. Really, we have the tax in there already to, do a lot of that work, and just nobody's done it yet. And so this market is growing at 30% per year in the voluntary market. And, if people really are serious about decarbonization, as I think they are, I think it's going to keep growing at that rate.
So I agree. And there's obviously the political part of it is actually different than the marketplace part of it. One's trying to play the other to see where things are going, but it's a little overwhelming right now, but it's certainly hot.
The other way to do it is with the wood. I mean, if you take acreage out of production and you use it to grow a forest, eventually you're going to get to harvest that wood. And this is an enormous opportunity. If you think iron and steel are 10% of the world's CO2 emissions, and there are mass timber products, wood products that can displace iron and steel in construction, you actually get a double benefit. The first benefit is you don't use steel or cement, 1 to 2 tons of CO2 per ton of product. You use a carbon neutral product that comes from wood. And two, you can then replant that acreage after you've harvested it and grow even more wood and take even more CO2 out of the atmosphere. But commercially, and where it's interesting is you might not get paid for the carbon, but the wood is basically made of carbon. And so if you're selling the wood, at $25 a ton to $75 a ton stumpage, you can get paid for the carbon right there. And even more if there was a CO2 price as well.
Yeah. So, and we've been on here a while, and just in case you forgot, dear listener and viewer, this is Rob West. He's the founder of an analyst company called Thundersaid Energy, and he's been very gracious, and he's probably overwhelmed you with some of these numbers, but he's got a lot to say, and you can actually go to thundersaidenergy.com, right? And if they want to see some of the stuff you're working on.
That's right. Yeah, we have a free distribution list, really just to help educate people, give them interesting ideas around what are the economically rational ways for the world to get to net zero.
I like economically rational, and I want to hear this. Okay, so what do my people out here working in the business of agriculture, mostly North America is where my listenership and viewership comes from, what do they need to know? They see a lot of stuff, man. The farm trade papers, and everybody's talking about this. What do we need to know, Rob? When's it coming, and how? What should I just say, hey, I got a bunch of acres, I'm doing conservation tillage, I'm doing no-till, I'm doing this, I'm going to take this chunk of ground over here and put it in trees. I just need to go and call up some company and say, will you give me money for that? Because that's kind of not happening right now. What do I need to know? What do these people need to know?
This market's in its infancy. If the world is serious about getting to net zero, this is going to be the single biggest opportunity in the entire energy transition. I'll just give you the numbers. We've got 50 billion tons of CO2 per year right now in the world.
50
By
billion tons of
2050,
CO2 is what we're producing in the world.
every year. If we do nothing, by 2050, we're going to be 80 billion tons of CO2 per year. And if we're going to take out those 80 billion tons of CO2 per year, well, there's actually enough opportunities, there's enough technologies to take out that 80 billion tons twice over. So, my economically rational roadmap picks the lowest cost opportunities out of 100 different opportunities we've looked at. The single biggest one is restoring nature, soil carbon, reforestation. And I think that's going to do over a quarter of all of the decarbonization in the world. That's about 35% more than all of renewables, by the way, to put the number in perspective. And so this is huge, but
doing it through ag, we can get rid of the 50 billion tons that are going right now. How many can we get through? How many of them can we then yank out of the atmosphere through ag? Done right?
I have 20 billion tons per year in my numbers.
Okay,
the reforestation number is pretty certain. I've got it at 15 billion tons a year. The soil carbon bit is less certain, and that could be anywhere between 1 and 15 billion tons a year, depending, because those studies that's an earlier technology readiness, that's less reliability in the data to go on.
Last question, and it's a little off the reservation, but not really. The lashing out against meat. I like meat. I like dairy. I like cheese. I like ice cream. I like pork chops. Am I still going to be allowed to eat meat? Because that gets blamed for environmental degradation, but it's really not even CO2 stuff. So what's the deal on meat? Are we gonna have regulations on meat, or can we just be fine as long as we harness the carbon dioxide and keep doing what we can do on our best land, and then take marginal land out, do all that stuff? What's the outlook for meat?
Well, I think it's a real shame policy-wise when the policy comes down to, let's take this thing that somebody enjoys and ban it. Yeah. But it's a challenge. Meat is probably, how you measure it, 8 to 15% of the world's CO2. It's 80% of the world's agricultural land to produce 20% of the calories. It's a really challenging question. I think at the margin, more people are going to choose plant-based diets where they really care about sustainability. But I think it links back to a very broad view about energy and energy transition, which is, remember that the goal here is not to get the world to net zero at the expense of all the people living in the world.
Right.
The goal is to meet the demands of the world, to allow people to have, enjoyable, fulfilling lives, and take out all the CO2 in the process. Mm-hmm. And this is why, you make the really good point that we probably want a decarbonization solution that allows people to continue enjoying things that, within reason, make them happy, and offset those, environmental consequences, rather than a set of blanket bans that, actually end up with everybody being unhappier.
Yeah, right.
So that
it
might be a nice place to leave it.
Less CO2 with a bunch of pissed off people isn't good for anybody either. All right. Well, I can tell you what, I've enjoyed this a lot. He threw a lot of information out there, but I gotta tell you, I've enjoyed it. And I think I agree that agriculture is a big part of the solution. And when you get past the screwball politics of it, we know that the reality is every day, the plants and the stuff that we take care of the earth. We grab stuff out of the atmosphere known as atmospheric carbon, and we utilize it for plant growth. So I appreciate being on. What else you got? Your last thing you want to tell anybody? Rob West, Thunderstead Energy, closing statement.
No, that's great. I think we covered it.
All right. So anyway, check him out, thundersetenergy.com. I really appreciate you being here. Until next time, reminder that this Business of Agriculture podcast is brought to you by Harvest Profit. Harvestprofit.com is where you'll find a software solution that'll help your agricultural enterprise be more profitable. Check it out. Okay. Thanks a lot, Rob West. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Damian. Thank
Until
you.
next time, it's the Business of Agriculture.